John Mosman. This is Talking Right with John Mosman, and whenever or however you are listening to this, whether it be on Spreaker.com or via YouTube.com at my channel, thank you very much. You can find out more information about me and about what I'm about at my website, johnmosman.net. I'm still working on some things on the website, kind of constantly am a mad scientist trying to make sure that I get that right. So if you've heard my previous episodes of the podcast, I talked about some of the more pressing issues that have been going on, but they do relate to a grander scale of what really this podcast is about, which is about talking right, about what it means to use the right words, what it means to have a correct value and a correct view of the world. These things all interrelate. And so while there might be times when I do talk about some of those pressing social issues of the day, a lot of what I'm also going to be talking about is basic concepts, because part of talking right, a part of understanding some of the right way of looking at things, or being conservative, obviously I'm a conservative, and how to talk and how to think conservatively. These are things that are important. And in our day and age, it's almost impossible to get that right, to get some kind of thinking of what it means to be conservative, So I thought today what I would talk about is the roots of conservatism and where they start from. Because there's a lot of people, especially here in America, who think that conservatism started with the Enlightenment, or might have started with the Constitution, or with the founding of this country. But from a statistic standpoint, that's just not true. From a factual standpoint, that's just not true. And while a lot of today's conservatives here in America hold true to some of those values that the founders of America had, which some of them had some really great values, the reality of the fact is that it is not the base, the root, the original source of conservatism. Not for here in Western civilization. So obviously, when we talk about conservatism, especially in the sense of it being in a Western civilization standpoint, from everything that you go, because there's a type of conservatism, I should say, that might happen in the Eastern world that is completely, totally different than in the Western world. And I would say let's start with there and say that the first thing you have to understand is conservatism in the Western world is completely different than any kind of quote-unquote conservatism in the Eastern world. Both have a high value of traditions, but one tradition is based on a value or on a philosophy that itself, from a technical historical standpoint, is not really a conservative value, that did not come from the root of conservatism. And if anything, conservatives in the Western world can say and will say that the source of conservatism that we have is the original source of conservatism. So let's get down to things. First and foremost, you have to understand that conservatism, like other things in Western civilization, start with the church. Start with Christianity, because it is actually, after all, Christianity that is the bedrock of Western civilization. Of course, that was civilization before the progressive, communist, socialist, radical progressives have tried to eliminate. But Western civilization has always started with church. And so we have to think about the fact that the early conservatives, the very first conservatives in Western civilization and Western society, it started back in Europe, and it started particularly in places like England. In fact, Britain was the bedrock of conservative values for the longest time. And you had an understanding, because you had the Catholic Church, which was everywhere, but was of course the official church of the English kingdom, of the United Kingdom, of England. And the idea was we had to stay true to it. Now, from a long set time, there have always been rulers that have emerged in the English monarchy. Not that many, but there have been a few before Anglicanism was invented that tried to stay away from what the Catholics wanted. And those who were in the English society who said, look, we have to stick with the church, we have to stick with the Pope, we have to stick with these values, because after all, the Catholic Church especially is the bedrock, the values that we see from the Catholicism and from the Catholic Church are the bedrock of Western society principles. And they wanted to keep adhering to that because they were loyalists. And of course, they were known as Tories. Tories, Tories. And they were kind of a watch group, if you will, in England, because you had kings. And there was a few kings that came out. King John, the one that we all know as Prince John from the Robin Hood tales. He was someone who was always kind of about establishing his own way. We had obviously probably the most notorious and infamous king who went away and did probably the most damage was King Henry VIII. And King Henry VIII, not only did he, essentially end Catholicism in England, at least for a good majority of it, he also established a new church where the king was the new pope, so he could justify his desire to have a new wife. So you had the Tories. You had the ones who were preserving the conservative value. They are the root of conservatism. And so what I'm going to tell you is this. If you can have certain conservative values, you can adhere to certain conservative values, you can understand certain conservative values. But if you're not a Christian, if you're not a Christian in the historical sense, if you're not in the at least the most liberal form of Christianity would have to be Reformed Christianity. You know, if you're in one of these big mega box churches, you're not conservative, because everything those churches represent are liberal. In fact, I find it very funny because a lot of quote unquote conservatives, political conservatives here in America, they actually are very liberal when it comes to Christianity and church. And I would say that it's very hard to actually be truly conservative politically, even though you can agree with some of those things, and be conservative Christian. But then that just goes to my point originally, what I started out with when I said that a lot of conservatives in America, the ones who say we want no government or we want low government, we want no taxes or very low taxes, these, quote unquote constitutional Republicans, in reality they're not the truest form of conservatism. And that's not a knock on them. That's not a bad thing per se of saying that they're not conservative. It's just a reality. Conservatism has to have those values. And so the question is, can you call yourself a conservative? I think that you can call yourself a conservative. Obviously, in our day and age, if you're against, socialism, or if you're against high taxes, or if you're, against big spending, if you're against a lot of some of these things, then you can be lumped in that group of people that we consider conservative. But but you wouldn't really be conservative in the truest sense. So what do we say for those people who are conservative to some degree? Well, first of all, we have to be able to identify them as what they are. And most Americans who identify themselves as conservative in America, most of you folks out there are actually classical liberal. And it's important to establish classical liberalism because classical liberalism, while it has many great ideals, and it did understand the trouble of a government when it has its authority too much, right? Conservatism in its core, in its heart, is all about authority. It's all about respecting and defending authority, even if that authority makes some decisions, even if that authority makes some problems. And so therefore you'd say, can someone there be for moderate conservative? Well, that's where I think we have to go with many Americans who label themselves as conservative, as if they could be moderately conservative. And in that sense, I would be more comfortable, really, truly. Because the people who call themselves moderate and conservative, for the most part, actually what they really mean is they're a liberal, but they're not really liberal. They're not like hardcore progressives. But when we look at these things, we have to kind of say what these things mean. Because to be truly conservative means to respect that authority, to defend that authority. And sometimes conservatives in America become too keen with, like, libertarians, for example, in their definite disdain of big government. And the idea, therefore, then is that big government in itself is a problem. Classical liberals thought the same way. Classical liberals said, look, the king is a problem. Being a king, having a kingship is a problem. Having A, B, and C are problems. We have to have the opposite of that. A true conservative would really say that the problem isn't the king. The problem is that the king has forgotten his values. He's forgotten his oath. He's forgotten what it means to really be a ruler. And therefore, the issue then becomes not about whether or not government should be an authority or whether or not government has authority. It is that the problem is, at times, authority, which is good, when it has individuals, that those individuals in the place of the authority, therefore, are doing something that goes against the grain of having authority, true authority. So conservatives, like the Tories in England, how they would justify how they would justify some of that would be that a king's true role was to his people, to serve his people, almost kind of as Christ was, right? Within the Christian conservative lexicon, to be a true authoritative figure does not mean to be a benevolent tyrant. It means to be a leader, a loving, kind leader who at times might have to be stern, who might have to defend the enemies at the gate, may have to use force, but for the most part does not use his post, does not use his status, does not use his godly given status to defile the kingdom, to defile the church, to defile the people, to serve with his own purpose. And something that people within classical liberalism understood really good is that sometimes authority can corrupt. Now, some of them might say absolute authority corrupts absolutely. I completely disagree. And I think anyone that was a conservative of their merit would also disagree, because then the same could be said for Christianity, which is the reason why a lot of libertarian, classical liberals are actually also atheist or agnostic, which has to also be pointed. Which goes back to the whole issue of religion being probably a central key figure of your ideology. Despite the people, in fact, that think they can separate the two, or that's truly not the case. So we have these Tories. They began conservatism. And then as the years go by, as classical liberalism starts to emerge, now we start to see another kind of forefront of conservatism. Because there is definitely, truly, like an element of conservatism within classical liberalism. And who we consider the modern day leader of that, or the classical liberal of that time, of the 1700s, would have been someone like Edmund Burke. He exemplifies many things that many modern conservatives believe in. He may have not had some of the same rigid, to some people's viewpoint, defense of certain authority. In fact, he bucked authority at times. And the question then becomes, where does authority really land when it comes to conservatism? Edmund Burke really understood that sometimes you have to buck authority when it comes to the more pressing social and even religious issues. One of the things Edmund Burke really fought against was trying to get slavery ended. Him and a couple of other people at that time really fought against it and helped to get England to get out of slavery. But he was also a keen voice when it came to the American Revolution. And when people started talking about going to war and yada, 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 there was definitely an understanding from him that even if he disagreed with the reasons why the Americans decided to create their own country, from a conservative understanding, he understood that going to war did no good. And he understood also that the part of the problem that the colonials faced, and was a justifiable problem for them, was the issue of taxes. And this is where we start to also see the tax issue become an important thing. And I would say that as a conservative, even if you were to say you were the hardcore conservative to the nth degree, you would not want to say anything to the fact that, okay, well, I believe in authority, so that means authority should do whatever it wants. That's not what I'm saying. And that's what I'm saying. That's what the Tories did. They would hold the king to that. And in fact, when the earliest Tories, when the king decided, King John, when he decided he wanted to go against the Magna Carta, they definitely riled against that. You see, because authority, when it's used to oppress, cannot be accepted. That's what Edmund Burke shows us. And also, that's where taxes come. And for a lot of people, throughout the history of Western civilization, one of the big issues has been taxation. Taxation without representation, taxation for whatever reason. And there is an understanding that if you're going to tax a man and you don't give him an ample ability to vote on it or to make a statement on it, that there's something unfair. Even if you say we have to maintain authority. The question about authority for people who are conservative isn't that there is some despot ruler or some rogue person with a crown should be able to do whatever the hell they want to do. It's the quite opposite. Is that there's a responsibility to leadership. And this goes back to, again, the Christianity being a huge part of conservatism, because in Christianity, in Christ, we see the perfect example of the king, right? He came to serve, not to be served. He came to die, not to, set himself as a ruler. And so a true authority figure should at all times do everything to do what's best for his people. And that's not what King George III was doing. That's not what he was doing at all. He saw that the little war that they got into with France was causing problems, and he felt it was right. And I guess in some ways you could maybe give some credit to why you might want to tax the colonists, because the colonists were the ones that the colonies were the ones that were affected by the British-French War that happened in the early 1700s. But the question has to be, and this is where it's at. The question has to be, whose responsibility was it to protect his colony? And I'm sure he could have found money elsewhere. But taxation becomes a huge thing. Because it is with taxation, as it has been in England, and it's been here now in America, where a country dictates to you via taxes. It becomes a means of oppression. And so therefore, we can see that taxation, responsible taxation, is a key issue for conservatives. And so is the moral issue. What we see at the beginning, in the mid of the American Revolution, and towards the end of the American Revolution, when America becomes a country, but in that period of time, in that era when conservatism as we know it is starting to adapt from the Tories, we see that taxation, slavery, moral issues, freedom, these become the huge issues. And if you can say anything about moderate conservatives, that's what I call them, but the classical liberals, the conservatives of today, the majority of conservatives today, those three issues still kind of remain. We still talk about moral issues. We still talk about what's right and wrong, as in regards of abortion, or what's in regards of, things that are occurring that are polluting the family or corrupting the family. We still have a high reverence for God. We still believe in representation of taxation and a fair taxation, and then also an understanding that there is a deal of freedom for people to be free of tyranny. These are things that still matter to conservatives. So when I talk about roots of conservatism, when I talk about conservatism in general, I'm telling you that a lot of conservatives today in America still have those values. They do. They still have them because they've been a vested part of conservatism for the last couple of 100 years. And I think those values are still going to be the big ones for conservatives for a long time, probably forever, because those are where the issue happens. I will want to say this, because I do sometimes think that one thing that has polluted a lot of modern or moderate conservatism has been the fact of the idea that we go to war for whatever reason. You will see that in conservatism there is a tradition of being very timid, very, very, very cautious about going to war. George Washington, who was in a lot of ways the first true constitutional Republican president, conservative president, talked about that fact. In fact, him and Thomas Jefferson would go back at it because Jefferson wanted us to support France in their revolution. And Washington knew that while America did have to go to war for its freedom, that's not something that you necessarily should make yourself, a military powerhouse. Obviously to defend yourself, but not to get into interactions. And unfortunately, the Hawkeyes or the Rhinos, which are people who are neoconservatives, and we'll get into neoconservatism next time. They're actually not really conservatives. Neoconservatism is not conservatism. They call it neoconservatism because we assume that people who are against war are liberals. And if you've studied any kind of American history, you're going to realize that that notion is complete bunk. So if we go to the roots of conservative values, those are the roots that I just said. They still remain. Responsible government, fair taxation, moral government, being moral. And what I mean by that is not necessarily having a moral dictatorship or not asserting, but making sure that we stand up for the moral issue of the time. For the longest time, it was slavery. Now that issue has turned into abortion, and there's a lot of similarities between those two things. So there's those things. There's that element. However, here's what I would say. While I agree that there's those core values that many today modern conservatives have, they have lost some. And I think that we can call anyone conservative is not good. I think there's a very specific litmus test, if you will, for being conservative. And I think that there's a lot of things that when I said that conservatism comes back to Christianity, I think that there have been a lot of liberal Christians out there calling themselves conservatives who have said, I can just do my church any way I want to, I'm going to buck all traditions, I'm going to be oppressive, That is not conservatism. Even if you disagreed with the papacy, even if you disagree with even the Reformed churches that many people you were raised in, who now have their own churches or go to a church where they don't even have a doctrine stance, the reality is that for those people, they don't realize that that is a key component of them being very conservative. And I'm willing to go more into those kinds of things. If you'd like to talk about this issue, you can find me at Twitter at JOLEMO376. You can find all my social media networks at my website, johnmosman, MOSEMAN.net. This is Talking Right, and I'll see you guys next time.